Can the mythopoetic worldview really be of help for those of us who are change workers and change makers, whether that be therapists, guides, teachers, coaches, healers? Can it really be of help? Can it really be something that has tangible efficacy in the work that we do to help others to heal and to go on that journey of individuation? Well, listen to this conversation between myself and Josh Schrei to find out. Hello, Josh. A huge welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, really, really wonderful to have you. And I want to dive right in. As we were just talking about, I often notice that people's own myth is seeded at some point in their childhood. And so, before we even start to talk about the wider topic of a mythopoetic worldview and how we can enter that work with it as change workers, I'd love to know if you had those seeds yourself, where you can really see that myth of you began, and if so, what they were.
Yeah, well, I was raised in a Zen Buddhist community. My parents adopted Zen Buddhism early on in its journey to the West, and so I was raised like completely steeped in that Buddhist
Oh
tradition.
wow,
And
unusual.
it's interesting because I think that people think of Buddhism from an adult's perspective, you could say, is very kind of meditative and focused on, mental concentration and meditative practice and this kind of thing. But for a kid, that's not how a kid necessarily absorbs it. For a kid, all the animate beings on the altars and the stories of talking animals and the stories of an animate world really seep in a different way. So while I don't
Mm.
know if the adults were necessarily aware that they were practicing an animate tradition, as a kid, that's kind of the aspect of it that I absorbed. I was told the what are called the Jataka tales, tales of the Buddha's past lives as a fox or a monkey or a parrot, and this really, I think, instilled in me a world that was vibrant and alive, in which everything around us is speaking with a voice. And that kind of set me on the road. And then when I was 13, we went and lived in India for a year, and that blew my mythic world wide open because
Mm.
it's a place where myth is alive, and it's in the day-to-day lives and hearts of the people, and it's passed on through story and through sung invocation, and it's not a dry subject to be studied in a classics course in a university.
Mm.
It's actually a living, breathing reality. And really, that was a big part of the impetus behind starting the podcast, is that I thought that a lot of the discussions on myth had become very analytical and cerebral. And, myth is something that has tremendous, potent relevance for our lives. And to speak of it abstracted, to speak of it as kind of, an analysis of written words on a page, doesn't do it justice. It must be approached differently. So it's really kind
Mm.
of how I was started on the path of the mythic, and why I, started the podcast that I started.
Oh, I love that so much. That really makes sense. What you were saying there as a child growing up in a Buddhist context, I could really feel why it was so different to how we typically would think of a community. It reminds me, I'm in a group that's all about different conversations around shamanism, and there was a post by one of the admin that I just happened to be scanning earlier, and she was explaining something that you'll completely understand this. It's like we talk about a Western world view, because it so informs most people's, even if we start to reclaim an animist worldview, we still
Mm.
have that kind of lens that needs to be cleared, if we can, of a Western worldview. And
Mm.
the post was all about really what you're talking about there. It's like we've been raised where the world isn't animate, the world isn't mythical. Most of
Mm.
us in this, like whether we want to call it a modern context or Western context, and so it's funny that the very first conversation I've had after reading that is someone who actually unusually was raised in a Western context, but with a much more, I guess, animist worldview.
Mm.
I can really feel like it's just like infused with magic in a way that's just completely, as far as I'm concerned, real and yet
Mm.
magical.
Yeah, there's
Oh,
a lot. The majority of people that I interact with and speak with from the quote unquote Western world either, came from agnostic or atheistic backgrounds in which their parents had already made the decision to reject, a religious view for very valid reasons, or they come from you know, they were raised in some type of Western religious background and they've rejected it themselves. And yeah, there's a lot of unpacking work that often needs to be done to wake people up to really the presence and immediacy of the mythic, the presence and the
mm,
immediacy of a living world, the presence and immediacy of agencies all around us. And, you know, traditionally, that didn't happen through reading books. And, books are wonderful. I love books and I read a lot of them. But it didn't happen through reading books. It happened through hearing story. It happened through sitting in a circle and, you know, humming along to the ancient songs. It happened
mm,
in ways that actually stirred things vibrationally awake in people. Traditional myth was sung and incanted in meter, and there was a rhythm to it and a melodic flow to it, and it was often told ceremonially, and it was told in times when people had maybe been fasting for a while and were in heightened states of consciousness.
mm,
And in that place, the myth has the power to shake things awake within the person, to take them into deep states of ecstasy and trance and connection to a living world around us. And it's very, very different than studying it objectively from afar. So,
mm,
really, what I hope to help, and there are a lot of people doing this now, but what I hope to help reintroduce people to is that living spark of myth, that living
mm.
spark of myth. Yeah.
I really had this, I guess, glimpse of your soul being brought to this knowing when you were describing your time in India, where I was like, funny enough, before you mentioned books, I was like, yes, of course, that's, for those of us raised outside of that context, I think that you speak to someone about myth and their mind automatically goes to a book. It's just like, that connection is just there because we are so bereft of the embodied living of myth. And you're quite right. The Jung quote, one of my favorite quotes, is something like enchantment is the oldest form of medicine.
Mm.
And my sense is one of the main forms of enchantment is exactly what you're talking about. Exactly what you're talking about. Sitting together. It's only one way that we can enter myth, but like sitting together and it's brought alive and it's activating and it's enchanting, it's
Mm.
inviting, it's enlivening. And it's completely the opposite. I remember some of this is going back years ago when I first began bringing myths into the way that I led women's circles, and the pushback and the resistance I used to get was, really quite. I look back and I think I understand why, but it was just like, I just couldn't focus and it was boring. And I feel like I don't really understand why, what relevance does this have? And that's probably partly at that time my own lack of being able to bring that alive. But I think there's also just culturally, we have a resistance to be enchanted. There
Hmm.
is a resistance, or maybe a kind of like the pathways aren't quite open for us to fall into that enchantment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, we live in an individualist, compartmentalized modern world in which we're told that the most important thing is our individual agency and the fact that we're in control of our lives. And
Mm,
the mythic invites us into a space where we have to surrender that a little bit. We have to surrender to what you could call larger forces of nature, larger animate
mm,
flows, where the narrative that I am a producing, consuming individual who makes every decision in my life, and where that starts to melt away a little bit, and we start to see that we're part of a larger network and feel that we're part of a larger network, and that can be really challenging for the Western mind. We are societally, I would say, to generalize, fairly stunted when it comes to understanding different states of consciousness. You know,
yes,
modern
yes, yes.
modern psychology identifies like four. You know, there are tantric traditions that identify thousands of states of consciousness, like fine
Mm,
gradations of states of consciousness. So the lull that one might feel while listening to a myth, the focus it demands, like all of this is part of working with consciousness and to try to get us into a different state where we can receive things more easily and feel our interconnection with community and ecology more readily. Like it's all seeking to get
mm,
us somewhere. And if we have a natural kind of cultural resistance to that, then it can chip away. It can grade at us in many different ways. We could be like, this is boring. I can't pay attention for that long. Some of the longer Indian myths are specifically designed to weed out people who, can't pay attention for a long period of time. And then that's the practice over time, is to start to
mm,
be able to link our consciousness to the myth and be taken on that journey and have it transport us somewhere. So it's working with concepts of agency, not even concepts, it's working with agency directly, it's working with states of consciousness, it's working with all the things in the Western world that you know we've been taught in a very human centric way are like vital to you know the freedom project, the humanism project, like this kind of thing. It's
mm,
getting us into different spaces, and that can be uncomfortable at first. And then a myth, a story, maybe listeners have felt this. A story goes to work on you, right? There's a beautiful book called Wisdom Sits in Places about the Western Apache and how they view story and land and their interconnection. Like maybe you felt like a story goes to work on you. You hear it and you're like, oh, that was interesting. But then if it's told in a way where something opens up in you, then you can feel it kind of working on you over time. You can feel it like
mm,
moving through you. Maybe your dreams change a little bit. Maybe, different moods arrive that you're not used to. And that's the living presence of the story working on you. Yeah.
mm,
So, in the Western world, we have to make a concerted effort, I think, to get away from a process that has been mostly about, like, okay, let's sit around and talk simply about, my individual process or what's going on for me, and understand how cultures have traditionally done it, which is to link to a larger story. And in linking to that
mm,
larger story, the stuff that we need to go through gets addressed, right?
mm.
It's a different model. It's a different way, and there's a lot more potential for community uplift when the focus isn't just on each individual. The focus is on we're all resonating around the same story. We're all resonating
Yes.
around the same mythic journey.
Yes, yes, yes. I was just listening to you talk. I was just pondering again how even and maybe especially for those of us that are working in some way or other as change makers, change workers, how even when we have been touched by myth ourselves and taken on that journey by story, there is a kind of, again, because often we would have been trained in a very, taught, trained, studied, learned how to work with people in this Western worldview where none of what we were just talking about exists. It can
Hmm.
feel quite a leap to then start to work with. I mean, it's easier if you, like part of my background's in shamanism. And so that allows you to kind of step into a completely different way of working with people. But if you haven't been drag kicking and screaming, as I was, if you haven't ended up in something like that, if you have, for example, trained as, I don't know, a counselor or a therapist or something a little bit more normal, I imagine it can seem quite a leap to recognize that, as you say, like these other states of consciousness, these other realities, not just not just exist, but they could be even more powerful in creating healing, creating change.
Hmm.
I'd love to know your thoughts of having witnessed other people in this work, whether there's ways that we can perhaps more readily open the door to that way of working with people.
Yeah. Well, I have an episode called Animism is Normative Consciousness. Animism
Mm-hmm.
is Normative Consciousness. And it goes into this like, we have to, I think, in the Western world, recognize, take a step back and look at ourselves objectively a little bit and recognize that the way that the Western world sees the world is not normal when it comes to the long
Mm.
scope of history of human beings. Like our ancestor, the word animism was invented incredibly recently by, colonial anthropologists basically to try and give a name to the thing that they saw absolutely everywhere in
That's a
every
really
single
good
cultural
point. That
in
there's some,
every
I've just
single
got to stop
cultural
there.
tradition everywhere.
Yes, of
Like,
course. Even the name is
yeah.
a modern concept.
Yeah, and so really
Yes.
what animism
Mm.
is the way it is.
Yes.
Animism is the way it is. For
It
for
just is. Mm.
whoever is listening to this, 99.9% of your ancestors saw an animate world around them. They
Yes.
interacted with an animate world. It's only when you become distanced from that that you have to label it from the outside and give it a name and
Mm.
call it, oh, this is a little bit woo or this is a little bit fringe. Well, what are they saying now that modern humans have existed for 300,000 plus years? Well, for those 300,000 years, our ancestors interacted with a world that was animate. Tyson Yunkaporta talks about like, even if you're European, like the blink of an eye ago, your ancestors were in deep reciprocal relationship with land and the forces of land.
Mm.
And don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that you have to start going around like pretending that you're seeing fairies or nature spirits or anything like this. It's not about that, but it's about slowly, surely, steadily starting to build up a deeper relationality that understands that the world is an interconnected web that is not so focused on the individual as the pinnacle, but is much more focused on ecosystems. And when we do this, we start to understand, and see and open ourselves up to, oh right, like the forces of nature are working through us all the time. This natural, like we're nature, the very fact that we have the word nature as something separate from us,
Mm.
like, oh, I'm going to go out into nature. You know, we're in nature. We are part of nature. We are an exhalation of the watershed that we live in. We are intimately and forever connected in this web of relationality. And what myth and what an animate worldview can start to do is open up to that deeper relationality. And it opens up us up, like you were using the word enchantment earlier. It opens us up to a wondrous view of nature and an enchanting
Mm.
view of nature. But it also opens up to a deep reciprocity and responsibility that comes too. It's not like the goal of the mythopoetic isn't to have, everybody in kind of a state of just like, wow, that's beautiful. It's not just that, You talk to indigenous traditions and they say to wake up to the animate world is to wake up to our relational responsibility. That
Mm,
the same way we feel a relational responsibility with our closest friends and allies and our relatives, possibly, that we feel a
mm,
relational responsibility with them, we have a relational responsibility to land, and we have a relational responsibility to the beings that inhabit land. And so animism is incredibly practical. Like animate,
mm,
Graham Harvey has a great quote where Graham Harvey says that animism is about actual relationships instead of theoretical ones or possible ones.
mm,
Like it's about recognizing, what are the dynamics at play in a watershed? What are the dynamics at play on a moor? What are the dynamics at play, in a singing circle? Let's go deeper and get into the relationality of it. And when we understand the relationality of it, it's incredibly practical and pragmatic. It's
mm.
about like, oh, I live in this world and I'm borrowing from this world. I'm borrowing food from this world in order to stay alive. I need to offer something back too. I need to be in good relation with the ecosystem around me, right? So, when people talk about it being woo or that's a little, fringe for me, or I always come back to like, it wasn't fringe for your ancestors. It was the way
Yeah.
that they saw the world. And it's not trying to take you into some, illusory fantasy denial of reality type space. It's trying to take you into a deeper, more pragmatic, ultimately more fulfilling relationship with the living world.
Yes. There was a couple of things that occurred to me as you were talking. One was, as you were saying, this even the term animist is a made up modern term, and I was just
Mm.
like flipping it thinking, yes, of course, from our, I really want to say like our true worldview, that animistic worldview, you would have to make up a term for an inanimate reality.
Yeah,
It would literally have to somehow conceive of none of this being alive, none of this
yeah,
being real, and then create a term for that. And there was something, I feel like something like shifted in me where it was just like, oh gosh, like it's like a, yeah, there's moments of it, it's like turtles all the way down moment. You sort of drop down another turtle.
well,
So
if
thank
the
you.
podcast can do anything, I hope it drops people down another turtle. So yeah, yeah, and that's the thing.
What a
Like,
claim to fame.
and that's the thing. Like, we have to be able to take a little bit of that, the same view that we've taken to other traditions. We have to be able to take to ourselves and
Mm,
say, oh, like, you know, all across the ancient world, every single cultural tradition is all based upon a living, breathing world, right?
mm,
It's all based upon that. So yeah, they would have to come up with a name for, the people for whom the world is dead, the people for whom the world is
mm,
objectified, right? And there's really not many of us compared to that ancestral flow that again goes back 300,000 years. And, this is like in the history of Western thought, like a really interesting place to look is the Greeks, because, we tend to again think of like Greek mythology and Greek, like the Iliad and the Odyssey as something that philosophical that lives in the pages of, the curriculum of a classics department and this kind of thing. And if you go into the Greek vision of the world, it is animism. It is every
mm,
river and every stream and every, there are deities that watch over potters' kilns and deities that watch over everything. Everything is personified. Everything is animate. And the way that the ancient Greeks actually practiced was animate, right? It was for thousands and thousands of
mm.
years. It was about deep interrelationality with local beings of place. So it's a perfect example of a tradition, that eventually became abstracted in the Western mind, became, turned into a philosophical metaphor in a way. When if you look at the
Mm,
beating, when you look at the beating heart of it, it's deeply, deeply animate. They had named and honored and worshipped the river goddesses. They had like names for every single stream and creek and river that extended like all throughout the Greek peninsula, all across Central Asia, and all of them were considered to be living, breathing beings, and all of them were
mm,
interacted with like that. So even within the Western tradition, the history of the animate, it's a very recent thing. You can even look at the history of Catholicism and Catholic saints and how animism was kept alive through saint worship in Europe.
mm,
That saints were very much associated with particular places and particular springs and this type of thing. It really, really ultimately comes with the rise of industrialization and the humanist revolution that we see this separation from the animate. It's really a
much
function.
more recently
Yeah,
than we
it's
tend to think. Yeah.
much more recently. Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying about the kind of like just actual practical nature of all of this, it was bringing to mind how in the work that we do with people, and even in particular, for example, if someone's coming to me for a shamanic healing, within that, although it's me they're coming to, and they see me as the person that's doing the healing, I see it much more that I'm just helping to open a door to many of the things we're talking about here. And I've noticed that really simple practices like making offerings. So, for example, if someone's come from a healing, I'll ask them to bring an offering to the land. I'll ask them to bring an offering to the altar, which is really, to the spirits that are there to help them, their guides, their ancestors. And my sense is that it's, even though it might seem a little bit like sort of faking it until you're making it and going through the motions at first, there is something like it always activates this like DNA where in doing so, and it might take a few times of kind of, I'm making offerings, it doesn't really feel like I'm making an offering to anything at all, but I'm going to do it because it's the thing that I've been told to do, or I've kind of feel like I remember when I very first started the really simple offerings practice. It really did feel a bit make believe, a little bit silly, but I just had this sense of like, I'm going to do it because it makes sense. I don't really understand, like, it doesn't feel like my heart's really in it. It
Mm.
doesn't, I don't really know if there's anyone receiving the offerings I'm making, but I'll do it. And in the doing that, it was like that practical action of making the offerings opened these doorways into recognizing there is a real relationship here. There is something here that is way beyond me just in this kind of like almost like rote action. It started to come alive, and then more things, it like led to more and more things coming alive in my
Mm.
world. And so I'd love to know your thoughts. And I think again, whether we one of the again the practices we always invite students into is to like literally just go and create a relationship with a tree. So these simple, seemingly simple actions that initially might not make sense can lead to us starting to have an embodied and quite practical knowing of those relationships. What's your experience and sense of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I resonate with everything that you're saying. The motions are important. Going through the motions, right? Like that, it's part of our fractured relationship with ritual, where because either we were raised with what you could call kind of dry, empty ritual, or we were raised like rejecting ritual altogether. We don't see the actual power in setting the stage and going through the motions and how that sets us up for transformation. Like transformation is actually set up in the process of creating the container for the ritual to take place, and how you create that container is really important. And everything starts with an offering. You go to every animate tradition all around the world. They wouldn't recognize it if it didn't have an offering. Like,
Yes.
if you think of kind of the classic, like say, like Freudian model of I'm just going to go into this room and lie down on this couch and start talking about myself, right? Like, you know, how do you expect transformation to happen if you haven't offered first? Because there's a
Mm,
flow that's created. There's a, and I talk about this a lot in the courses I teach, which are about reintroducing people to these fundamentals, really. You know, there's something just in the somatic gesture of opening up one's palms, in that
yes.
when one opens up one's palms to offer, then one has opened up one's palms to receive. And there's a flow that's established then between what we call ourselves and the larger world. If that flow hasn't been established and it's all just me, it's all just like my transformation, right? That then things can't get in to move and do their work within us. And
Mm,
it's really the basics of understanding like the reciprocal flow between us and the greater world around us. So there has to be some kind of offering. There has to be some kind
yes.
of, I offer so that I can receive. I offer so that I can receive. These are like, the fundamental dynamics of flow, of energetic interchange. So I think, it can feel awkward at first. And then the rational, like, if someone's, for example, like feeding food to the tree outside and stuff like that, then the rational mind comes in and was like, you know, I'm not feeding food. It's just going to be eaten by ants. Well, I'm not feeding food to the animate forces. That it's just going to be eaten by ants. And it's like, well, the ants are animate forces too. The insect world plays a critical role in all of this. And one doesn't have to
Mm,
expect that little offering to be magically like carried away. And it's good to get out of the realm of Western analysis
mm,
and just do it for a while. And this is like the huge mistake that colonial anthropologists made when they encountered traditional ritual. They hadn't done it themselves. So they
mm,
extrapolated and extrapolated about this is what it's for and this is the purpose, and it's like you don't
mm.
know until you do it. You don't know
Yes,
what you're talking about, like the power of feeding and offering. You don't know until you've done it consistently for at least 6 months, you know?
yes.
And, that takes some retraining in our minds too. Like, oh, I have to do this every day. I have to keep up with this. And then when we
Mm,
keep up with it, I was just talking to a Native American elder yesterday. And he was saying you go out in the morning and you say your thanks and you greet the living world around you, and at some point the winds are going to start speaking to you. At some point, you're going to have an experience of the animate moving through and communicating, right?
yeah.
And you don't have to strive for it. You don't have to look for it. You don't have to pretend you've had an experience when you haven't. You don't, because sometimes people can get into the kind of making up, like theatricality of it. Like, ooh, I heard the stones and I heard the wind. It's good not to be too theatrical about it, right?
Mm,
It's simple. It's simple. And as we develop that relationality, things will start to move and we will start to feel things in a different way. It'll happen. But
yes.
it takes that regular practice of offering to get there.
Mm. A little memory came to mind just then as you're talking, how again we can kind of bring that Western mind to practices like this. And I recall several years ago, my gardener at the time went past. We've got a silver birch in the garden, which is a place I often make offerings, and he spotted. I think there were like some ripe peaches I'd offered, and he said. He said something like, "Oh, you've got some." I think he was confused, almost like I'd done it by mistake. I don't know, but he sort of said
Mm.
it in this kind of like, "Oh, do you realise you've got peaches there?" And I said, "Yes, I gave them to the tree." And then he
Mm.
said, "Oh, does the tree like them?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And then he just sort of looked at me and I looked at him and he just sort of kind of went away, didn't say anything. And I was just like, I wonder what was going on. Like the way we just engaged the whole conversation was sort of like, we'll have like is exactly as far as I'm concerned, we're having the conversation. Like that's exactly what is happening. I'm giving them to the tree and he's asking, does the tree like it? Which it feels like to me a really beautiful question. Like the way that
Mm.
he even was able to enter, like in a level where it's like to ask that question. I was like,
Mm.
I wonder where that took him. Like, wonder where that thought process took him. But that just came to mind as you were saying that. There's you mentioned kind of working in a kind of more what makes it like, that laying on the couch, analytical way of working. And I was pondering this when we were talking earlier. Like, I'm a real fan of Jung and Jung's love of archetype symbol.
Mm,
And my sense is, having spent many years really kind of looking deeply at where Jung was coming from, I think to a very large extent he would be, in absolute agreement with everything we've been talking about. And
mm,
yet, I think there's a way we can engage in symbol and myth and archetype that isn't the way we're talking about,
mm,
like where it's like, yes, we'll look at the symbols, we'll look at these archetypes, but sort of still at one remove, still
yep.
still in quite an objectifying fashion. And I think, even again, for those of us that are working in some way as change workers, I think to recognize that that will likely be a temptation to kind of like, there's a different way of relating to these things that, we're touching into. But this isn't a particularly good question, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on what I've just said.
Oh, I know exactly what you're getting at. Yeah, I actually, and I think, I think the word archetype is beautiful, and I think that when we talk about archetypes, that can be a really beautiful conversation. I actually don't use it that much because of that exact reason. I feel like,
Mm,
the particular, the animate for like trickster isn't an archetype like trickster is trickster. Like,
yes.
the like the queen of the ocean in the Afro-Brazilian traditions, she's not a symbol for something else. She's
But
that
she
force.
is.
She is that force. And I think Jung was well aware of this. And Jung spoke about the reality of imaginal forces. And he spoke
Yes.
about, and I think for Jung, I have no doubt that the archetype was a living, breathing spirit energy, however you want to call it, animate force, not a abstract symbol for something else. And I
Yeah.
think that over the years it's been abstracted because of the way that the Western mind relates to things.
Mm,
All right. Kali in the Indian traditions, Kali isn't a symbol. Kali is time within which all of us will eventually one day die, right? This is a living force that we're within. We exist within the force of time. Time changes us. Time changes everything. Everything resolves itself through time, and then we will pass on. And these bodies will pass on through time, right? It's not an abstraction. It's like it's a living reality, right? So to
mm,
start to to chip away at that barrier, I think is incredibly important, right? To understand like when we offer to something, we're not offering to a symbol for something else. We're offering to the thing. We're offering to the thing itself. And the thing itself is alive. It's a living it's a living force. It's a living
mm.
presence. Shamanic traditions don't talk in terms of archetypes, right? Shamanic
No.
traditions, you're like, you know, did you go to the other world? Who did you see there? Well, who's here in the room right now? These are actual deep pragmatic questions of immediacy and relationality. They're not questions of
Mm.
symbolic navigation. They're questions of the immediate, yeah, the
Yes.
tangible.
Not
And that,
metaphor.
you
Mm.
can't snap your fingers and just dissolve that Western veil. It takes time, right? It takes time.
Mm.
For
And
me, it.
sorry,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to
Well,
say it takes time. And just speaking personally, times of forgetting and remembering or being clouded. And I had an experience that came to mind as you were talking, where a week or so ago, I was preparing to do a shamanic healing, and for reasons I won't go into because it would be too long, I had I had this kind of, what appeared on the face of it is this disaster where I was burning some charcoal in order to burn some kapow, and ended up having this like enormous fire, which I then had to put out with water. but was
Mm.
still so like I was just so oblivious. Like normally I'd be really paying attention to the kind of like the way the elements were showing up. But for some reason I just was blind to it. It wasn't until the second time it happened. I mean, it's never happened once before. The whole thing happened twice. And it wasn't until I put the fire out the second time, I just was suddenly like, oh my goodness, like I was acting as this is just like mundane, like, just a very like Western view of fire, and then put out
Right.
fire of water. Like I just wasn't seeing the reality, the spirits there. And I had to see it twice before it just like, oh my goodness, I'd forgotten
Mm.
and remembered again. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think there's times where there is a humility involved in realizing like we are so wired and tapped into this modern worldview. It's easy for us to have moments where we forget and need to remember again.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, a lot of the issue in the modern West is that we simply haven't felt it yet, right? Like I was in India, in southern India, some years back, about 14 years ago at this point, and inadvertently was invited into a ritual space. Just happened totally, you know, casually. Like I was in a little village and was invited into this ritual space, and I didn't know what I was getting myself into,
As all great
and I
stories
was
start.
I wasn't I wasn't looking for. Well, what actually happened is I was riding my motorbike through the rural areas of Karnataka, and I would just have a habit of I just wanted to check out the villages back there and everything, and wasn't a tourist area at all. And this little village, I got off my motorbike, and these school kids came running up to me, and this little girl who was about 9 years old came up to me and said, "Do you want to go meet the goddess?" And I said, "Yeah, I want to go meet the goddess," you know. And
An
I
offer
thought,
you can't refuse.
exactly. And I thought she was going to take me to like a lot of those villages have a central temple with a goddess image in it. And instead, she took me into this room where there were about 30 people. And there was a small shrine in there, and it was dark and lit with candles. And the officiating, the person who was officiating started invoking and invoking and invoking, and all of a sudden something shifted, and people were convulsing on the floor and shaking, and a wave moved through that room that was not an archetype. It wasn't a symbol for something else. It was so tangible and so powerfully real that I could barely lift my head. Like, and that got me very interested in transpossession traditions, and I've continued to study transpossession traditions because they're everywhere and they're a huge part of this type of work. And in those spaces, it's so tangible and it's so present and it's so undeniable. And a lot of Westerners simply haven't had that type of experience. Like, they haven't had the experience where, like, it can remain theoretical. Like, okay, I fed my tree outside, or I fed the little shrine, and did I feel something or did I not feel something? And there are spaces, and our ancestors spent a lot of time in these spaces. There are spaces in which the power of nature, the spirit energy, whatever you want to call it, is so tangible and so undeniable that we simply can't, we can't just write it off. We can't say it's abstract or symbolic. It's like, no, something moved through that room, something. And from that day, I go back to India a lot, and I go to rural goddess temples a lot, because at those goddess temples, I've felt something tangible, very present, you know. And if we start to peel back the veil a little bit, we start to see that that type of practice is everywhere. It's all across Africa. It's all across Brazil. It's all across India. Traditionally, it was all across Southeast Asia. It's certainly in Indonesia and Bali. You know, animate practice that gets people into deep spaces where they feel things that are undeniable. It's present, it's real, it's not abstract, it's as
Mm.
real as the person sitting next to you. So I encourage people to seek out those types of spaces, because if it all remains kind of an intellectual exercise, right, then we never get to the place where we can actually like really, really tangibly feel it. And there's ways to go, there's spaces to feel it.
Mm. I love that because I was going to say to you, is there any other way that people can more fully step through the doorway? And I think you're right, is that, and I think we've is part of that call to experience that is probably behind much of our kind of modern obsession with psychedelics.
Mm.
Not that there's no place for that. It's not that I'm saying don't do that, but I think it's helpful to know, but that's by no means the only way to experience what you're talking about here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are tried and true ways to do it all across the world that do not involve psychedelics, also.
Mm,
Psychedelics can be incredibly potent gateways to those states, and I think it's really important to have the right context.
mm,
And I have a lot of questions, and I talk about this on the podcast a lot about the psychologization of psychedelics,
mm.
because ultimately what you're talking about is spiritual experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So psychedelics can be an incredibly potent way to get there, and it's also important to remember that there's lots of ways to get there, and
Mm,
that you know traditionally ritual is done communally, and it's done. There are solo rituals, but traditionally it's done communally, and it's done in a way that facilitates a deep individual experience without it being all about the individual. And
yes.
when it comes to psychedelics, I'm sometimes concerned that the psychologization model leads people to have these incredibly powerful experiences that they can only see as being all about them, when they may not
Mm,
always be all about them. They may be about the larger world around them. It may be, something moving through that needed to move through. And so it can put a lot of burden on an individual if they have this mind shattering experience that they then feel that they have to pick through the pieces psychologically. And yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that
mm.
I'm like against psychology or anything like that. I just think that you know I think that the therapeutic process is important, but I think that we're called in these times towards what you could call a more relational vision, and a vision that gets us out of the center of the picture a little bit and puts us in a larger web. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
I so agree. We are up on time.
yeah.
I've so enjoyed this conversation. It really has flown by, but we need to draw to a close. Where can listeners find out about you, your wonderful work, including your podcast?
Yeah, well, the podcast is called The Emerald, and you can find it on any major podcast platform, including Spotify and Apple and all that. And then I have a Patreon page for people who want to support the work, and I offer twice monthly study groups through that page. So people who want to study the myths on a deeper level can come, and we're having a call today, in fact, and going into some interesting territory. And that's patreon.com/the Emerald Podcast. And those are two good ways to get involved. And if you want to be on if you want to be on a mailing list, there's an email address. It's themythicbody@gmail.com. Themythicbody@gmail.com. And those are good ways to get in touch. And yeah. And I appreciate
Wonderful.
the conversation and taking the time. And yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation too.
Thank you so much, Josh. That really was. I feel like I had an experience, like a meta experience of some of the things we were talking about.
Nah, good. That's the point. And
Wonderful.
I hope the listeners felt something too.